In today's video, I'm going to be building this sideboard, partly because we need more storage in this room, partly because I was looking for a woodworking challenge, and so when I designed the unit, I designed it to be a tricky build, and I certainly learned a few things along the way. So back to the beginning of the timeline, to the timber yard. We decided to use ash for this project because we wanted something a little bit different. The way our timber yard works is we tell them what thicknesses we're after and then they bring down the relevant pallets. We then sort through them and find the pieces that are most suitable for our project. This can take some time. Back in the workshop, after the timbers had a few weeks to acclimatise to our space, we then start to work out exactly how we're going to use it for this project. And it's not the easiest task. First of all, you need to work out which bit of the timber is most suited to each application, how you're going to nest it together to get the most value out of the timber, and then how you're going to fit it all through the machines. To make matters harder, all the chalk marks that you put on to mark the timber is going to get planed off shortly, which means you need to find some means of keeping track. You might have also noticed that we're using rough-sawn timber, and I think this is a bit of a woodworking hack because it's considerably cheaper purchasing it this way than the fully planed alternative. So much so that you can very quickly start to justify the expense of a thicknesser, particularly if you go for the more compact lunchbox version. And of course, as soon as we got started, we realised our chip collector was full.
Oh, that's full.
And I mean really full. I wonder if anybody's found a good use for these wood chips. We very quickly filled up our garden waste bin, and then as we kept planing, we ended up mulching all the hedges in the area. But there must be more value to these wood chips, and we just can't find it. Maybe we need to get a rabbit. We then set about planing all the boards. Of course, we start with the big flat edge, and that removes any twists, bows, or cup that might be in the board, giving us a perfectly flat surface that we can reference against the fence, and give us a perfectly flat and perpendicular edge along the narrow side. Our planer then transforms into a thicknesser, which is a great trick to have in a small workshop like this. We then ran the boards through the thicknesser with the planed edge referencing the bed of the machine. This then gives us a top surface that's perfectly parallel to the bottom surface and also a controlled thickness. We now have a board that's square on 3 sides. And the table saw gets the 4th edge square and cut to width. One of the most important things with any panel glue up is to arrange the board so that you have a nice aesthetic. This panel, which will later become the shelves of the unit, I was able to arrange all the individual boards so it looks like it's one single cohesive board that could have grown from one big tree. With this first glue up, I decided not to use any kind of locating element like a biscuit, domino, or dowel. That's because I thought it might be a quicker process, and if I can make it work this way, then it's much easier. But as you'll see, it started to skew as the clamps went on. I then had to use cauls to pull everything flat again, and in the end it became much more time consuming and fussier than would be ideal. I'm in the midst of gluing up all of these panels at the moment, and I'm finding it's taking longer than I'd anticipated because I don't have enough clamps and I also just don't have enough space for this number of glue ups. What I did find with this glue up, which is going to be the shelves on the final project, is there was a slight step here between 2 of the boards. Now I'll be able to sand it out and it will disappear, but it's a lot more hassle that I don't want on all the future glue ups. So to prevent that, I'm going to domino all my future panels. The only problem with that is when I looked at my domino supply, I only have a handful of the dominoes that I need. And I could use a biscuit jointer, which I do have in the cupboard, or I could use dowels, but I like my domino, and I had to think about it, and I bought these router bits some time ago, just for this instance, where I run out of dominoes, and with this, I should be able to make as many dominoes as I need for this project and future projects. So this panel's a bit wider than I need it to be, so I'll rip it to final width, and with that offcut, I'll be able to make more dominoes. With that procrastination complete, I can then get back to the glue up. With the dominoes this time, everything went very smoothly. Cleaning up the glue squeeze out as you go is a really important step. If you let it dry on here, it can stain the grain and be very difficult to remove, even tearing the wood as you remove it. Instead, just wipe it away with a damp cloth, or wait for it to dry and go a little bit gummy and then scrape it off. In my experience, either approach works equally well. The final glue up, and this is a big one. And the reason it's so big is because we want waterfall edges on our final piece, so we need to glue up the top and sides as a single piece. Now, before we can glue this up, we need to rip down the final edge to get 4 square edges. But getting a square edge on a board this long with a compact table saw can be difficult. So a few pieces of advice. Use an outfeed table, use a fence extension because the stock fence just isn't long enough, and stock guides are also a really helpful addition. If you follow this advice, it's almost difficult to get anything but a perfect cut. This was the biggest glue up on the project and it couldn't have gone smoother. It was actually nice to do a long, narrow glue up for a change, as opposed to the short, wide ones where we're always struggling to get big enough clamps. Typically, I like to meticulously plan projects and the order of operations, but for whatever reason on this project, I just created some basic dimensions and then decided to wing it. So without much of a plan, I thought a good place to start was at the base. We're always juggling for space in the workshop, so maybe it makes sense to start at the bottom? The foot design that I've come up with requires a mitered corner, so I need to swap out the zero clearance insert plate for a 45-degree variant. I then set the saw to 45 degrees. Accuracy isn't essential for this, but it's always good to aim for as close to perfect as possible. I then do a quick test and that's good enough for me. And then the foot design that I've got requires a bit of a curve, so it's much easier to make a template so I can batch them out and they can all be the same. There is a left and right hand version of the foot though, so I need to make sure that the template's reversible. I can then use the template to trace on the shape of the foot that I'm looking for. But I said I didn't have a plan, and it now occurred to me it would be much easier to add the dominoes now while the part is still big and square. So I add dominoes to the feet, and then I need to cut the rest of the frame so that I can add dominoes to them too. I can then get back to shaping the foot and remove bulk of the material at the bandsaw. I can tell you, after years of using terrible bandsaws, it's such a pleasure to use this one. I can then cut up to the template on the router table, but one thing I learned here is don't use a compression bit. Instead, use a straight pattern bit. That compression bit was actually one of my favourite compression bits that I've used many times and always with great results. But apparently Ash is a very grabby timber, and compression bits can also be quite grabby, so the combination is not good. Although that last clip didn't show it clearly, I was only removing about 0.5 millimeter of material using the correct technique, and I was holding everything very securely, but with those scary results. I swap out to a straight bit and all is good again. I can then glue up the feet, clamp them and leave them to dry for a few hours. In only a few hours the glue will set enough that it will be strong enough I can complete the rest of the assembly. I can tell you I'm really appreciating summer, the warmer temperatures and the faster glue times that leads to. In winter, with the humidity and moisture that we have in this climate, it can take an extra 12 hours to complete this step. The last detail I want to add to the legs is a shadow gap. I think this is a nice aesthetic, but also it hides any imperfections in the fit, so it's nice to have. Because it's going to be a cross-grain cut, I try to score the line as much as possible to reduce the chance of tearing out. I then use a grooving blade to make the cut. In my opinion, this is an underused and undervalued blade type to have in the workshop. A dado blade, sure, will do the same thing, but they're a lot more money, they're more time consuming to fit, and not all saws can accommodate them. With a grooving blade, you do need to purchase different thicknesses for different uses, but they come with a nice flat tooth profile, and they're something really good to have in the armory. Since the easiest way to make this cut is put the fence right up to the blade, I put a sacrificial piece of wood onto my fence extension, which I can secure easily with T-nuts, and then I can make my cut. And then I did the final assembly and glue up, hoping all the time that all those shadow gaps do line up perfectly. I had to do some interesting clamping here because I didn't have any clamps long enough, which does come into play later in the build. Thankfully, everything lined up perfectly, and as you can see here, I added a middle leg. It probably wasn't required, but it did make me feel a little bit happier. And the last detail to add is a very subtle chamfer to all of the edges. These types of details are always my favourite parts. Such a small change can make such a big difference to the overall look and feel of the piece. We then sanded everything down and added a finish. This is a UV curing hard wax oil that we're huge fans of. It goes on like any other hard wax oil. You apply it with a buffing pad and then you wipe off the excess. But there's no concerns about working time because it won't cure or harden until it's exposed to ultraviolet light. Then it will cure immediately. This finish is Ozlex Invisible, which we'll link down below, and we made a whole video about this and other hard wax oils where we tested them and looked at the merits and qualities of different kinds. We think it's a good video, although nobody else has watched it, so if you are interested in that, we'll link it down the description as well. Next, we're going to work on the front panel, which will eventually become 4 separate doors. Why are we working on it now? Well, it's because I thought I might mess this step up, and if I mess it up now, then I have an opportunity to fix it. It's a particularly thick board at 32mm thick. That's so that we can carve into it and we don't run any risk of scooping into the hinges or anything we don't want to go into. But it's also because it's what we could get from the timber yard, and we didn't want to just mill it away and waste all that material that we've paid for. Some of you may have already guessed that we're planning to carve a random Naguri pattern into this panel. This is a traditional Japanese technique that I'm no expert in, but I believe it's done with a hand gouge traditionally, but in our last video we created this jig so that we could do the same thing with a router. We've kept the panel as one large piece at this point so that the pattern will be continuous from door to door. We then found if we had a low light casting across the panel, we could find any areas that needed another go. And then of course everything needed sanding, and so that we didn't lose too much of the pattern we had to sand into each of the scallops. This was really tough on our hands. Dora first sanded until her hands were blistered, and then I sanded till my hands were blistered. We also realised that where we moved the router faster, it left worse score marks, which meant more sanding. So with the benefit of hindsight, we would have been much better off taking a bit more time with the router and saving ourselves a lot of time sanding. And then since that panel went well, I could then turn my attention back to the rest of the unit, starting out with the internal dividers and trimming them down to length. As you'll see, the crosscut slide gets a lot of use in this project. And then as I went through this project, I was constantly sanding everything down. Much easier to sand a big flat panel than it is lots of individual assembled pieces. Started at 80 grit, then 100, and then 120 grit. 120 grit was as far as we needed to go with the finish that we're using. And then I needed to cut the long panel to width, which meant I have to open the workshop doors so I've got enough space to maneuver everything. I'm not sure how important this is, but I tried to make all the cuts where one part had to be the exact same as another part on the same day, so there was no risk of one expanding or contracting from one day to the next and then me having uneven parts. I was also very careful while the parts were unfinished and unsecured relative to each other that they weren't going to warp or twist or move on me, and I was very conscious of that throughout the whole build. The front of the unit's going to have a 30-degree chamfer detail, so I do that now on the long panel while it's much easier. I found that ash does have a tendency to tear out a little bit more than other timbers, so I add the chamfer detail in 2 passes. I also leave the panel long at this point, so if any tear out happens at the end, I'm going to cut them away later on anyway. And then I add a rebate to the rear of the panel so that I can recess a back panel later on. It's now time to cut these panels into a base, sides and top. And they're going to be critical cuts because they need to match up with the existing base, and I want the height to also match up with furniture I'm going to have in the room beside it. And I'm going to make that cut more difficult by having mitered corners with a waterfall top and sides. So I've been contemplating how I can make this cut consistently the first time every time. And it's not as easy as you might think. The miter saw would tick all those boxes for me, but it only cuts 300 deep, and this is a 400 deep panel. The track saw is another approach that I've seen people using, but when I've done testing with this, I found it very difficult to set the saw to a perfect 45 degrees, or preferably 45.1 degrees, so that you get a nice tight join at the outside perimeter. In my testing though, I didn't get very good results, and I would say I was maybe like 0.3 off with each cut, which leads to a 0.6 degree error overall, which really doesn't look very good at all, and it's just not good enough for this project. Also, the saw tends to rock a little bit on the track, so I suspect on some of the cuts you'd end up with just a little bit of movement where that miter will open and close and not look the best. So instead I'm going to do what I should have maybe done from the beginning, which is use the table saw. This is something I was avoiding because it's not the best to put something through the saw when it's landscape instead of portrait, but I think I can do that safely using our crosscut sled. But first I needed to straight cut all the panels to length. I was very careful to label them all up so I didn't cut anything the wrong way, and to maintain the waterfall edge I don't want to lose any more material than the blade kerf, so all cuts here are the final lengths. You might be wondering how we're going to cut mitres on a crosscut sled. Well, we have this extra groove in the outfeed table that allows us to move the sled over one. The sled then references just the one slot on the table saw, which is plenty secure still, and allows us to cut a mitre at the edge of the crosscut sled. We can then set the saw to 45 degrees, or in this case 44.9 degrees. It's always tricky to work out which side of 45 it needs to be. It seems different on every saw, but a quick test confirms that this is exactly what we want, a mitre that's slightly tighter on the outside. Because we don't want to lose any extra material from the outside of this mitre, we take our time to make sure that the blade's cutting in exactly the right place. After all the faffing around we did with the track saw, I can tell you this is a much easier way to go. Much more accurate and no burning on the mitres. We then dominoed all of the mitres, though I'm now beginning to question if this was the best move. The dominoes do hold that mitre perfectly aligned and ensure, in theory, a perfectly crisp edge and a stronger joint, but it does require a lot more force to pull those mitres together, and as you'll see later on in the video, that causes a bit of problems for us. So I wonder, maybe we would have been better off without any mitres? I'd be really interested in your opinion on that once you reach that section of the video and see the problems that we encountered. You might be thinking we're close to gluing up the main body, but we've still got a few more jobs to do first. The top section needs some means of locating on the base. It could be screwed or glued into place, but I don't think that's really necessary. Instead, we're going to put these blocks into place so that when the top goes on, it locates just where we want it to be. I now needed to do something to secure the dividers inside the unit. There's a few options here, and the easiest approach would be to use dominoes, but the traditional approach that's also the strongest, it prevents racking and it's the most long-lasting, is to use a dado joint, also known as a housing joint. To accomplish this, I made this dado jig. There's a few different versions of this out online, and mine's a slight variation on all those concepts, but the principle is that you put the panel that you want to cut the dado for into the jig, you tighten up the jig around it, and as tight as you make it, the jig against the panel is how tight the fit will be. You can then remove the panel, and with a flush trim bit, you can cut that dado exactly as you want it. My design required that the dados didn't go all the way to the end, and I did it that way because I think it's going to hide the join best and be the nicest looking end result. That's easily accomplished with these stop blocks that I've got here. One tip if you do use a jig like this is make sure you stop the router before you raise it. That way you don't have any chance of accidentally gouging into the jig and effectively ruining it. A quick test fit to make sure everything fits nicely, and I'm really happy with that. So copy and paste a few times, and then we're finally ready to glue up the outside. Dora is only able to help out 1 day a week at the moment, and an extra pair of hands for a job like this is extremely helpful. So although we were low on time and rushed into this a little bit, we thought we had a solid plan and were prepared. That glue up was really not any fun at all. Probably our own fault because we didn't do a dry run beforehand because we were running out of time, so we thought, oh, we'll just chance it, and it didn't pay off this time. Everything went wrong, really. We had these blocks on here that we double-sided tape on into place, and I think it was because we used carpet tape. We use carpet tape quite a lot to glue down jigs, and we find it's really good because it sticks well, but it peels off nicely. But in this situation, it tended to have these blocks just slide along and then peel off. So all the blocks that we had to clamp everything into place, it all just didn't work whatsoever. So we ended up having to clamp our clamps into place and come up with all sorts of strange ways to make things work. And it didn't work. We ended up placing so much force on the whole jig that the timber actually started to bow in, which opened up all the mitres. So we had to take all the clamps off and basically start again. And as you can see here, we've got a clamp to a clamp, and we've cobbled together what we've got to try and get the right length. So we got there in the end, but no fun, no fun at all. I'm going to sleep. It's the next day. I've given everything a light sand, and it's not too bad. The mitres are open up a little bit more than I would like, but I used the screwdriver trick, and I think with a little bit more sanding, a little bit more finessing, I think they're mostly going to disappear. Never be perfect, but good enough, I think. The bottom, they are a little bit worse, but you'll never see that. I also found that some of the panels were slightly stepped forwards than the others, but that was an easy fix with the chisel, so I think we're all good now. So it's now time to move on to the dividers. The stop dados I've cut look something like this. I could square up the ends and insert the dividers like so, but I'm concerned that the front edge might look a little bit messy. So instead I'm going to insert the dividers like this, and I'm going to accomplish that by adding this little detail on the top. To cut this detail on the dividers, I first get the depth of the dado. I then match the blade height to this measurement. I'm really careful here to try and cut the front edge rather than the back. As a general rule, I always try to put the dark sections of each panel towards the rear and hope that consistency will tie the piece together better. I then use the same measurement to set the bandsaw width and cut away that notch. And then I quickly removed all the edges so that nothing could snag during the glue up. And finally I cut dados on both sides to accommodate shelves. One thing I'm slowly learning about woodworking is accuracy is critical, and it's all about jigs and preparation. The actual cut is usually fairly quick, which can make it feel like you've over-prepared and wasted time being over-pedantic. But the moment you rush the process, you pay the price, and you often spend so much longer fixing something that you otherwise wouldn't have had to. It's a tricky one to learn, because when you get it right, the time saving's not obvious. It's only when it goes wrong that you realize taking a bit more time up front would have saved you all the pain that you're now in. But the good thing is there always seems to be a fix in woodworking. Thankfully, all the prep paid off here and no screw-ups. I now need to measure up for the shelves, and counterintuitively, they're not all the same dimension. One thing that required a bit of extra thought when designing is I want 4 equally sized doors, but that doesn't mean 4 equally sized openings. If you look at this model, we have 4 equal sized doors, but if we zoom in and move the doors out of the way a little bit so we can see the dividers, then we can see that the doors are sometimes on an edge and sometimes the center. That means the inner 2 cupboards are roughly half a divider smaller than the outside ones. I want the doors to open like so I need 2 different types of hinge. Off camera just now, I was cutting these shelves down to width, and I wasn't filming it because I didn't think it was terribly interesting. It's basically a copy-paste of what I did with the dividers, but I clearly wasn't paying enough attention and I cut the wrong direction. So I'm not best pleased with myself right now, and I'm trying to work out how to fix this. I don't have any more timber, so I can't cut a new shelf, but also the shelves had a nice grain, continual grain from one shelf to the next, which is maybe only a detail that I would see, but I want to maintain that. I do have an offcut, and I could patch using this, but it's from a different bit of the board, and the grain is quite different, so although it would be a reasonable patch, it wouldn't be invisible. So I think what I'm going to do, and this might be controversial, so let me know if you think this is the right move, is I'm going to use a contrasting wood to patch it, and it can serve as a little bit of a reminder to me whenever I open those doors to pay a bit more attention to what I'm doing when I'm making cuts. It can be a little bit of a story that stays with the piece of furniture. I think that's the right move. I'm not sure. You might notice the grain direction isn't going the same way, but for this little patch I really don't think it's going to matter. All in all, I'm very happy with the way it turned out, and I actually like the little reminder. The shelves can then be installed, just a little glue and a few taps with a hammer. For whatever reason, the first shelf was a little stiff, but the rest went in with a perfect fit. Next, the final sanding before finish. As I said, I have been sanding throughout the build as it's much easier to do it this way. That meant this was only really a final sanding at 120 grit to focus on the details and remove fingerprints. Then I bolted on this edge guide to our sander. If you don't have one of these, I really recommend getting one. I'm sure we've all done it where we've held the sander square to the edge ourselves and ended up rounding over the edges and maybe making a mess of the project. But with one of these guides, it's easy to get a crisp edge. We sell this one for our model of sander as either a physical version or a digital file that you can 3D print for yourself. But whether you buy from us or buy from someone else, I really do recommend this tool. When it came to the finish, we decided to experiment a little. It says on the tin that it can be applied with a roller, so we gave this a go. It applied very nicely, very quickly, but I won't lie, the thick white layer was a little bit worrying, not the look we wanted. But I cannot stress enough how nice it is to work with a product where you don't need to worry about dry time. So long as no UV light touches this, you could leave it for a week and it will still. To check we hadn't ruined everything with our roller application, we wiped away the excess to check it was all good, and of course it was all fine. Like most hard wax oils, the process is apply oil and then wipe off the excess. But it can take a good bit of effort and time to work the finish into the grain and the corners, which is why it's so nice that we can work at our pace and not worry about the excess until we're ready. I think we decided that the roller technique was good, but it was a little bit wasteful on product. So for the rest, we combined roller with a scouring pad, trying to apply lightly. Once we'd applied finish to every surface, we wiped it all down, removing the excess. I'm going to talk about our small workshop again, because in a small space like this, it's so difficult to find place to store things while you're waiting for product to cure. So the ability to instantly cure things like this is really, really significant for us, and that is why we're such big fans of this product. Then a light sand at 320 grit and another coat. This gives a much smoother finish, both to the touch and to the look at. As you can see, the mitres have closed up nicely, but there are still small cracks visible, so we work the finish in, we cure it, repeat until the cracks have disappeared. We then added a back panel to the sideboard in the form of 6mm plywood. This adds some stability to the piece, but it's probably not necessary on something as solidly built as this. Instead, it's more about stopping anything we place inside the unit from falling out the back. We painted the plywood dark blue, which I think complements the unit, but it also matches the colour of the wall that the unit will sit in front of, so it should just all blend in and disappear. There are holes in the top of the plywood in case we ever want to bring power into the unit, and we secure everything with screws. It's been a long old journey to reach this point, but we're nearly there now. I really appreciate you sticking with the video to this point. So I'm now going to work on the doors, and for whatever reason I was very apprehensive about this. I just had the feeling that I was going to cut them to the wrong size or something very silly like that. So I was very, very cautious through this whole process. First of all, rip it down to width, and then there was a patch on the back which I thought was going to get cut away, but it wasn't, so I'm going to have to patch it. I removed the bulk of the material with the router, just cutting up to the line by eye, and I thought I would use a chisel to cut away right up to the line, but when I got to here I thought, why am I making my life difficult? I may as well make a little template and go right up to the line. And then there's still no choice but to break out the chisels to square off those corners. After I cut the panel to be the perfect size to fit into the cabinet, I then very carefully mark up the location of each door. In this case, the blade kerf is going to be the distance or clearance between each door, which keeps life easy and keeps that distance to an absolute minimum. I'm also very careful to mark up the order of the doors and the location of hinges and handles so I can maintain that pattern and keep track of everything as I go. And then the part that had been unreasonably worrying me for far too long, cutting the doors and hoping they're the right size. Bit of a strange thing to worry about, because if I can't cut to a basic dimension at this point, then what am I doing being a woodworker? But nonetheless, it was one of those little things that got into my head and was worrying me. And then I wanted a really simple handle design that required a 25mm hole. So referencing the rear surface, I put it into the pillar drill and I can drill a perfectly square hole. And then, being really careful to drill on the correct side, I use this concealed hinge jig to make short work of drilling out for the hinges. And then these doors at 32mm thick and overall proportions probably don't require any additional battening to prevent warp and twist happening. But for belts and braces, I thought it would be a nice idea to add a sliding dovetail. So I used the grooving bit once again to remove the majority of the material for the dovetail. I then select a dovetail router bit and put it into the router table. You might also notice that I've got a brand new router fence. This arrived just in time for this project, and although my old homemade router fence had served me well for years, this version is so much more refined and easier to work with, and I'm very pleased with it. Something that may be of interest to UK viewers is I noticed that this fence from Banggood is exactly the same as you can purchase from Rutland's, only a slightly different colourway and half the price. That led me to digging a little bit more into Rutland's range, and I realised that a lot of their products are exactly the same as sold on Banggood, only twice the price. Now, you do get really good customer service with Rutland's, but I've also heard a lot of reports of them being rather selective about what reviews they choose to publish on their website, which for me breaks the trust. At this stage of things, I've invested a huge amount of time into these doors, and any mistakes I make could represent a huge time loss and quite a significant financial loss. So everything I did, I triple and quadruple checked everything to make sure it was exactly the right move. That said, on the final cut of the fourth door, I realized that the router bit was far too high. So I double checked the router bit height, and sure enough, it was far too high. I checked the doors and there's no consistency there. They're all over the place, and frankly, they're unusable as they are. So that's where I went to bed last night. I was not happy, couldn't see a solution. Because it's a dovetail cut as opposed to a normal straight cut, I can't just go deeper because it would create a sort of Christmas tree effect, and that's no good for strength or stability or aesthetics. I was not happy last night. But I've done a bit of research this morning, and I think I found a solution to all of this and the cause of the problem. So a dovetail bit produces a lot of upwards force as it cuts, and I think all in all, I'm 99% sure that the source of the problem was I simply didn't tighten the bit in the collet enough. And that's partly because these bits maybe have a little bit too much grease on the shaft, a tiny bit, but maybe that's enough. But also, primarily, when I put it into the collet, I did it on camera, and to get the shot, I had to kind of bear hug the camera, and it got the shot, but I didn't double check that it was tight enough. Now, don't get me wrong, it was tight, and I'd probably be fine with that on any other bit, but for a dovetail bit, evidently, it wasn't tight enough. So I think that's it. I still have a small fear it might be due to the resonance and vibration in the tool itself causing the whole thing to lift up. But I'm going to try and go again with a larger router bit set to the maximum depth of all the cuts. And because it's a larger diameter, it should remove enough of the shoulders that it will remove that Christmas tree effect. And I just have to keep my fingers crossed that that is the source of the problem. I will, of course, double check the height every time after every pass. And that's it. That's all in all, I think I will get away with it quite likely if that's all this is, and actually maybe I'll have a nicer result at the end of it. Problem fixed, and the router didn't move one bit during that whole operation, so it must have been that I just didn't tighten it enough. I did say I was worried about something going wrong with these doors, but the question is, would something have gone wrong if I wasn't worrying so much? Back to the battens, and I first remove as much material as possible over at the table saw. And then I make a final pass over at the router table. I'd left the router bit at the same height through this whole process. One of the nice features of this new fence is this fine adjustment so I could hone in on the perfect fit. I can then do a quick test fit, and in truth the fit is a little bit looser than ideal, but it's still plenty good enough. So I can glue it in place, and since it's a sliding dovetail, I'm going to glue just the top section, and the rest is going to remain sliding so that the timber can expand and contract through the seasons. I can then turn my attention back to the door handles, and these are going to be a simple walnut dowel that I cut down to length and then I glue into position. Look at how good that grain looks flowing from one door to the next. We're now going to apply finish to the doors, and since the walnut takes much better to the clear finish, we're going to mask the handles off first and finish that in clear first, and then we'll finish the rest of the doors in natural like the rest of the sideboard. Those little bits of fluff seem to be very obvious under the UV light, but once it's cured you can just wipe them away. We do have a slight niggling doubt now that maybe we should have finished the whole sideboard in clear. The natural does look really good in some places, but in other places maybe it looks a little bit plain. But maybe that is just ash as opposed to the finish that we're using. It's really hard to know at this point. That's the sideboard essentially complete, but you can't make a piece of furniture like this and not add a maker's mark. So fortunately we got our hands on this new toy. We did a good bit of experimenting to see what gave us the best results. We found that it's best to do the engraving after the finish has been applied, and then if you do an outline engraving first, and then you can fill in the gaps. I've used a laser cutter and engraver many times during my career, but never one that's so handheld and easy to use. And for anybody wondering, these are the settings I used for the outline and for the fill, though you might get different results on different timber species and different finishes. And now all that remains to be done is fitting the hinges, but like everything on this project, it's not as simple as it seems. I 3D printed this template which should give me the correct position for the hinge mount on an inset door, but since the surround protrudes further than the door itself, I need to make a custom template. I then put that into position, bring the door into place, just to check everything is as it should be. I can then mark the location of the holes and drill out with a 5mm drill bit. And then the moment of truth, I get to see if it actually fits. And thankfully, it does. Now, wouldn't it be nice if it was the same story for the center hinges? But it's not, because instead of these being inset hinges, they're half overlay door hinges, which means I need to use a different hole in the template. And that's this sideboard complete, and we can start to fill it with all our stuff. It certainly turned into a much bigger project than we'd anticipated. And so I apologize for the length of this video. I did work my hardest to bring it down to something more palatable. We learned a lot along the way. There were some mistakes made, but that's the best way to learn, I find. There were things we already knew, but going through this process the way we did reinforced a lot of that knowledge. And I think if we did do things again, there would be a lot that we would do different, but that I think is always the case with every project. And why when you have an opportunity to make 2, 3, 4, 100 of an item, you can do it better and faster and cheaper. We really appreciate your feedback, so please let us know what you think, and if you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. It really does make a big difference to the channel. All the tools that we use are linked down in the description if you're interested, as well as a few links to other videos that might be of interest to you. Next time, I think we need to do something about that wall behind. It's looking awfully plain. So until then, cheerio.